Good evening. It's time for Bible Q&A number 295. I'm going to be sharing with you a uh, segment I recorded with my good friend, Brother Bobby D. Gayton. I wanted to include his input on the discussion we've been having on slavery in the Bible. And I know after you see that, you'll be glad that I shared that with you. And I included his input with our discussion on that subject. His input was very very good, and I'm sure that you'll enjoy that. Of course, while you're watching the discussion with Bobby Gayton, be sure to post your questions and comments in the live chat. I'll be coming back to the questions and comments in the live chat after I share this discussion with you. I just posted the first part of my Bible study on Acts. It was Acts chapter 8, the first few verses of Acts chapter 8. And I posted a YouTube short from that where I made some comments about premillennialism. And that YouTube short is climbing in the views in the YouTube shorts, what they call the shorts shelf, and getting some comments um, from people in support of premillennialism. So I'll go and look at some of those comments afterwards. It's good to see you jumping in the live chat already, Lori. And I know this says James Fisher or James Fitch, but it is not James Fitch. It is Sister Gwendolyn. And it's very good to see you jumping in the live chat also. And be sure to post any of your questions and comments from my discussion with Brother Bobby. Be sure to post that in the live chat while you're watching, or any questions, comments you have concerning any of the other videos I've posted later last week and earlier today. Any questions or comments you have on any of those things, I'll be happy to discuss those with you in the second part of Bible Q&A this evening. Now let's get to the discussion with Brother Bobby. We've been talking about slavery in the Bible for the past few weeks, and because of my knowledge of Brother Bobby Gayton and his studiousness in the scriptures, I've known him for a very long time, and I've always known him to be somebody that studies things very thoroughly and presents a very thorough discussion on those things. So I wanted to get his comments on slavery in the Bible to go along with the other discussions we've had. Like I said, I've known Brother Bobby Gayton for close to 30 years, definitely over 25 years. Known him a long time. I've known him longer than he's known me because I heard him preach right after I was converted in '96. And that had a tremendous impact on me, that lesson. One of these days, I'm going to get Bobby to come on Bible Q&A and to re-preach that lesson, Paul, one who won, because I think that's why I'm a preacher today, because I heard that lesson. So I'm very familiar with Brother Bobby Gayton. I'm going to get him to introduce himself to you so that you can be familiar with him also. Bobby, would you introduce yourself?
Well, I'm Bobby Gayton. I am from Cartersville, Georgia, and my wife and I obeyed the gospel September the 14th, 1970. And I'm sorry, September the 24th. And what's about that date is that, matter of fact, 5 years before that date, we met on the very same time at that time. But we obeyed the gospel, and then eventually I went to the Memphis School of Preaching in 1973. I started preaching part-time up in here at Cartersville when they needed somebody, And also I went up into the areas around Jasper, Georgia, where you're familiar with all of that up there, but I forget the name of that little congregation out in the country there. But I went there and filled in on the, I think it was the third and the fifth Sundays, if they have a fifth Sunday. And then I went to the Memphis School of Preaching and graduated there in 1975. And then I continued my education going to now as the Ambridge University. And then after my degrees there, I went to Troy University and received a degree in graduate degree in counseling psychology. And eventually I went to did other things in reference to grief recovery and further educated myself. And I had the privilege of coming back to Cartersville, and I preached here for 26 years. And because of my health, I had to retire. And then I came out of retirement and started preaching and teaching at the Georgia School of Preaching and teaching at the Georgia School of Preaching. And but eventually, last April, I had to give all of that up because of my health. And I'm married. I have my wife and I. We have two biological children, and there is one child that we had for many years. And he and three granddaughters and three great granddaughters. And my son and I feel like when we get all together that we're in the minority. We have a cat and two dogs, and all of them are females.
That's what I said for a long time, is that I was outnumbered in my house because I've got a wife and a daughter and 4 female dogs. But then my daughter brought home a cat, and he turned out to be a male. So now there's 2 of us, you know, but there's still 6 females in the house.
Right. Yeah, I remind my wife and children that what the Bible says about the husband and father.
That's right. That's right.
Right.
Well, I'm very glad to be able to have you on Bible Q&A today, and to get your input in this discussion of slavery. We've had a couple of weeks of discussion on that. I think you watched that video and maybe saw some of the context, and you have some input from your study on that. So I'll just let you go ahead, and if I have any questions, I'll jump in and ask.
Okay. Well, since I went back and did some study in reference to slavery, I basically my upbringing, I had black folks live down below me, and plus my stepfather owned a grocery store in a dominant mercantile store, what they call it back then, in a very dominant black area. And so when we delivered stuff to them and things of that sort, and I was in school when they integrated this, you know, they put the blacks and the whites together in school. And so I had friends, great friends in reference to that. And even when I went into the military, I had great friends that were not only black folks, African Americans, as some are called, and but also an Indian, a full-blooded Indian was also in our company in Vietnam. And so, you know, I had conversations a lot of times with them, and also when I went to Memphis and the other schools, there were also different people there. And I said that we had a child. The child that we took in was a child that was the father was American, and his mother was a Filipino, and so we raised him. And we saw a lot of this prejudice stuff as we went in our life, because we'd go into Walmart or something like that, and here we were, a red-headed fellow, a brown-headed wife, and a brown-headed son, and all of a sudden here's this black-headed fellow and different brown skin. And people would look at us and, you know, very oddly. So we had to deal with this idea of some things. But to talk about that of slavery under that of the law of Moses, sometimes people forget to go back to look at the patriarchal age when there were servants and so forth. And then also to see that even the New Testament, basically Christianity actually done away with slavery. Most people don't understand that part, because we're all made in the image of God. And finally, as Christians were going about preaching, teaching the gospel, there was no distinction between them, no matter what they were, Jew or Gentile. But when you go back and look, and then you find that there are those people, the skeptics, that claimed that God allowing slavery under the law of Moses proved that God was the Bible is moral unjust.
Mhm.
And so, claim though is that God condoned that slavery in the old. And basically, they stay with that, as I said, with the law of Moses. They don't go look at other things. But the problem with this claim, and this is the big problem, is that that it amounts to comparing slavery in the United States of America and probably other countries, but with that of the Old Testament, not realizing they're two different things.
Right.
And the
And
analogy, you know,
that's one of the things that comes up in the comments on the videos quite a bit. Insisting that there's no difference between the kind of slavery you read about in the Bible and the kind of slavery that was experienced in early American history, for example, that there's no difference between those two. And that's just simply not true.
well, that's the thing, that when you go back and read, even if a person has a way to look up the word servant, slavery, and things that's the different words that are used in that of the Hebrew and also the Greek, which is the Bible, and the Aramaic too, which the Bible was written from the original. And so, if they would stop for a moment and think about the definition of slavery, and in most people's minds does not conform to the practice of Israel, the Old Testament. It's completely different than when someone begins to study that, they have to realize it. For instance, in the King James Bible, and in Jeremiah 2 and verse 14, and Revelation 18:13, he uses a word there, the word slave, and that's the only time they're found. But that word, if you go to the Septuagint and also to the Greek New Testament, is that word doulos, that means slave. And
Just real quick, would you explain what the Septuagint is? I mean, I'm familiar with the Septuagint, and I think probably most people who study the Bible are familiar with the Septuagint.
It's the Greek translation of the Old Testament. I want to say somewhere around 300 AD. And actually, it's when you compare the Septuagint to that of the New Testament, and listen to how Jesus speaks and how it's recorded, you'll find that that was their Bible during the Greek times. It was the Septuagint, and that's what they used. And so they use the same words, and therefore.
Now you said AD, but you meant BC.
Yeah, BC. I'm sorry. Yeah, BC.
Right, yeah. Right.
And so this is the one that they used. And so this in Jeremiah, though, let me get Jeremiah 2 and verse 14, he uses that word slave in the Septuagint. And there is another word that is used that people use, a homeborn. It's a word that means a family or a household kin. And that word is used also in the Bible. Like Exodus chapter 12 and verse 49 is actually there in the Septuagint. When you look at the translation there, it's the word native. He's a native. And so also a native, when we look at the Hebrew, it means a native or a full citizen. But yet the thing of it is when we read the Bible, who is this stranger that they talk about? And a stranger was a protected citizen, and the word means an alien. And we understand what an alien is, and it's not somebody from out of the earth, but it's somebody from some other nation. And so even over in Ezekiel, and which was written a lot later than some of the other books, that he talks about of the house of Israel and of the resident aliens, of those who lived among Israel. Mm-hmm. So again, who is that stranger, and who are these servants that he talks about? Under the law of Moses. And so again in the Exodus 12 and verse 45, he uses the term a hired servant. And since a hired servant, that's somebody they went out and hired. That means they paid them wages. Now, when we look at chattel slavery that we had in the United States of America, they didn't get paid. Now, the thing of it was, though, that when some of the slavery, and when I was in school and we studied, a lot of the people who were members of the Lord's church, they basically let their slaves go before 1865. And many of them stayed with them, and they actually paid them. They were sharecroppers, and they divided whatever the income was. And I thought that was very interesting back then that they did that. But I think that when we study slavery, or really any subject, that we always look at the context. And I saw when I was going back and reading things that where there were rulers and merchants and others of in the Palestine area that were they made the point for no man buy their merchandise anymore. In other words, that's what we find if we go back to Revelation 18 and verse 13, that nobody, basically the word nobody was buying anything from them. And so what it does there, and symbols, as we would say, is talking about the commerce and the characterizing that of the Jerusalem's prosperity. But the problem there is that when we get to that of the Old Testament and we study, especially under the law of Moses, we have to realize that we're comparing the servanthood as a testament with slavery in the early United States. And even worse is that some compare the slavery as practiced by the Muslims to the servant bond of that of the Old Testament. And some just to have a God who demands that we love our neighbor. Now, that's one of my favorite things that in my life as that of a preacher, that I'm to love my neighbor, Leviticus 19 and verse 18. But then you have the objectors who will come along and say, well, slavery, what about slavery? God allowed slavery, servant bound in the Old Testament, Exodus 21, and you've covered that very well in the other videos. But we should note that the word slavery and slave are not used in various translations. And when we studied that Old Testament, we see why the translators did not translate the Hebrew word as slave in the Old Testament. And so it is, to me, as I study, it's a serious mistake that people make to think of the slavery that's servant bound in the Old Testament as being like the slavery that existed here in the United States of America. And under the law of Moses, the master was not allowed. I mean, it's amazing to me that when you actually read the context, verses before and verses after, as we were taught when we start studying the Bible with hermeneutics and so forth, you have to read. And under the law of Moses, the master was not allowed to mistreat his servant. That's right. And so allow them to be abused, a servant or a slave, like that passage. And again, Exodus, you got it there on the chapter 21, verse 20. And I use the King James. And if a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he died under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Now that rod can be made out of wood or that of iron. That's the type of rods that they had, but they had other things also, staffs and swords, and they didn't use what they call the staff and the sword in that way. And so, but what really gets me is when you read verses 20 through 26, that he points out to us that this person who does this, he says, if he dies, he shall surely be punished. And I looked up that word even in the Greek language. It means there to suffer vengeance for a wrong done to another. That's what it means. And therefore, if he's done a wrong to the other, he may have chastised him with a rod. And if he got so angry as some people do today, and killed him, therefore he would stand. He would suffer the vengeance for what he had done. And when you go and look, the idea of that word means justice, penalty, and also judgment.
Right. That's the Lexham English Bible translates it. He will surely be avenged.
Right. That's a good translation. Matter of fact, he has some other good books that gives you that same author there. I think it's called Lexham. I think his name. He has some other good things in reference to that the studies that's been done on that of Hebrew words and also Greek words. As a matter of fact, he also helped translate. They helped translate the Septuagint that I use. But there was a man that wrote a book. Now it's hard for me to pronounce words. Especially his name is one of those names that I can't pronounce. But he wrote a book, and he said that the implication is that when you go and look at that verb that's used in Exodus 21 there, that the word always involves the death penalty in the Old Testament. That's his part. He says the implication is
like the avenger of blood. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, the avenger of blood was a close relative that could legally go and execute someone who killed their relative.
Right. And so, well, that's he says the implication there, and I heard this word, read this word on one of the comments about judicial. But this was judicial vengeance is the results
That's right.
of killing a slave.
Right. That was one of the things in the comments that they came back at me with, just with uh, a great deal of vitriol, just explicitly saying you're a liar.
Right. Yeah, I
Because
saw that.
yeah, because I said that it was a judicial beating that it's talking about, and I even showed where in the law of Moses that was prescribed by law, that there were things that people could be beaten for.
Yes.
They said there's nothing there that says it was a judicial beating. Well, yeah, there's all kinds of things in the language that shows that it was a judicial beating.
Well, again, when you go back and you look at the word like he is saying, that's exactly what it is. It's judicial vengeance. Its implication there is the result of that. That's what this man says. A debt and slavery in Israel and the ancient Near East is what he wrote a book. And we find that even Lexham's Hebrew lexicon says justice and penalty and judgment. So there is what we would call judicial vengeance that's going to take place. They're going to be judged because of the laws. I think that's another thing that what I saw when I began to read all these passages is that how the owner, the person who had servants and so forth in their homes, there was restrictions placed upon them, and if they violated them, the Jewish people had to carry them to, or make the accusation, carry them to a court or whatever it may be, or to the elders of that city and so forth, that this person has been doing these things to their servants, household servants and so forth, or even those that they had within their household. But the Septuagint is interesting to me because of Exodus 21:20. It translates, it says, and if someone strikes his male servant or his female servant with a staff, be a rod there, and he dies at his hands, he shall be penalized with a penalty. That's what he says. But if he survives one day or two, he shall not be penalized, for the silver is his. In other words, he still has the servant because he did not kill him. And so when you go and you look at all of that, again, even in the Greek language, it means there to protect, to defend one person from another, to avenge oneself. And so that's what takes place, is that when you have that servants that are there is supposed to be something. He goes on and tells us that word can also mean right, justice, a suit at law, a judicial hearing, judicial decision, a sentence of condemnation. As if we were to go to the New Testament, Acts 25 and verse 15. So it's an execution of sentence or punishment, according to other passages. And so the Bible points out that it is judicial in reference to the words that it uses. And that lethal weapon, the staff or rod, there, like I said, they didn't use a spear and they didn't use a sword. They had those, but they did not use those. Those were weapons for military things. There, and when they were in fights and things of that sort, that's what they would use. They didn't use a staff or a rod because you couldn't stop the oncoming of the enemy. So what if the servant died, then he had to. If he died, the slave died immediately. There was no proof needed. I mean, because the law said if he dies, this is what's going to take place. There's a penalty. So if any permanent injury even resulted, he goes on to say, even like losing an eye, losing a tooth, then that servant will be released from that of his debt. And notice what I said, death. In other words,
that goes back to him being his property or his money, his silver, as the Hebrew says. The master has taken ownership of that debt,
right?
And so if the servant dies as a result of the punishment, a day or two later, well then, obviously the intent of the punishment wasn't to kill him, but if he beats him to death, that's a different matter. Right. And so it's punished differently. So if he dies a day or two later, well, then the person is out that debt. I mean, they have still taken ownership of that debt. And
Yeah.
so, that the servant died, doesn't change that.
Right. Well, to me, when like I said, they call them, we called them slaves here in the United States of America, and they're really under. When you look at that word in the law of Moses, Hebrew, or that of the Septuagint Greek, it means servants, and
Right.
that's they were essentially hired servants, and so that's the reason why that. We would look upon them, that the servants were actually, according to what the passages, what other passages say, they were actually treated as family members, and they were freed after serving for 6 years and were paid. Now that's not true of those that were in the United States of America during slavery. Right. Servants were allowed to have wives and children. And if they had the wife prior to slavery, the servanthood, that's what we would call it, servanthood, because they owe a debt and therefore they're working it off, they were allowed to keep her. And so when you look at, I got down when I was studying Ezekiel, Exodus, have Ezekiel in my mind, Exodus 21, when you drop down to verse 5 in that passage, he says, but if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master and my wife and my children, I will not go out free. In other words, his 6 years is up, he's not going to leave. Then his master shall bring him unto God, and shall bring him to the door, unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. But that's his choice. He wants to stay with his family. And because now you look at it, that's his family, but also working for the person working for him must be did very well, or he stay. And so we find essentially it's saying that she did not have to be redeemed in reference to that of his wife. Other passages, and I kind of looked at studying about the flood. All I ever studied was Genesis 1 through last, and he realized that there are other things about the flood in other passages. So you go back to passages when you gather all this, and this is parallel to to Exodus 21 there. He says, if, verse 12, if thy brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, be sold unto thee, and 7th year thou shalt let him go free from thee, and when thou lettest him go, thou shalt not let him go empty. And he says, thou shalt liberally out of thy flock, and out of thy threshing floor, and out of thy winepress, as Jehovah thy God, American Standard, has blessed thee, thou shalt give unto him, and thou shalt remember that thou was a bondman in the land of Egypt, and Jehovah thy God redeemed thee. Therefore I command thee this thing today. Now he says, in other words, I'm giving this to you because you were a bond person, you were a servant, you were a slave. Now over there, now if you go back to the Egyptian slavery, it was kind of like the one in America,
right?
Because people were killed when they rebelled.
That's the thing, there is slavery in the Bible, like what, like the comparison they're trying to make, but it's not Hebrew slavery. Right. It's pagan slavery.
Right. Well, even so, if we would say we have Jews and Gentiles, everybody else is a Gentile, and then you have that group of people that we call it Jewish, then everybody outside of that, they had ways of things in to slavery, and not like the Jewish. It would be if I were been a Gentile. I'm a Gentile. If I was a Gentile and some Hebrew wanted me, and me knowing if I knew anything about how they're being treated, I'd want to go to them too, because of the way they treated them. Right. Like I hear my 6 years is up, he's gonna help me to make a living, to start my living for my family. And then if I don't want to leave, then he'll let me stay. And so the thing is that God even decreed that they should be paid double pay, double of the hire of hireling, and hath he served these 6 years, he says. So what we see here is that this slave, this servant, was being paid twice as a hired worker when he left. And so we would find that the Bible describes them, sometimes we use the word nomads, who ended up wandering into Egypt, the Egyptian territory, where they were made the slaves of the Egyptians. So and you go back to look at the historians, and they agree that Moses' people were these descendants. And so you go back and you find out, how did the Egyptians treat these people? And they were treated completely different than how they treated people, completely. And so the biblical categories of the Gentiles, if we were to go far as back as we possibly could, we would say the Amalekites and the seven Canaanite nations, the nations of the world, the Samaritans, the slaves, the resident aliens, and also finally the proselytes. The proselyte would be a Gentile. He may have been a slave, a servant in a Jewish home, a Hebrew home, and yet we find that he learned the Jewish ways, and therefore he wanted to be able to worship just like the Jewish people that he was a servant to. Then he would become a proselyte.
Right. And as a proselyte, he would have, what we would consider all the rights of citizenship.
Right.
He would be essentially considered a Hebrew from that point on.
Yes. And the thing of this, they had to treat him, and just stop for a moment and just say, okay, we're going to go read all the passages where a Hebrew has a Hebrew servant. Right. And therefore, what does the Bible say in reference to them? Because they are of the same religion. What right. does it point out for how he's supposed to treat his brother? And we know what it points out in how we're supposed to treat our brother in the New Testament. These slaves, and this is something else in Deuteronomy chapter 5, was 13 and 14. 6 days shalt thou labor. I like Deuteronomy better than I do text better than I do Exodus chapter 20, because he says 6 days thou shalt labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath unto Jehovah thy God, the American Standard. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou nor thy son nor thy daughter, but thy manservant. Now manservant, no, he says, nor thy manservant, and
right.
nor thy maidservant, nor thy ox, nor thy ass, nor thy any cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gate, that manservant and that maidservant may rest as well as thou.
Right.
And how was they treated? My understanding is, when I saw I saw that movie called Roots, and that helped me a lot. And then we were traveling one time, Linda and I, we wanted to go to this place. I forget what it was, the trail that goes through the South and so forth, where they carried the Indians and so forth. And yet we found that there were black Indians, and they were really slaves who had escaped. And but they joined the Indians, and they were called Black Indians. And it's just a great video that they have of that. But it points out to us in reference to the type of slavery that they had during that time, that they were so harsh upon them that they would leave and join with that of the Indians, and they were treated freely, just like an Indian. And so he says here that they shall not work. I thought it was interesting that he talks about the Hebrew thou and their son and their daughters, and then he talks about thy manservant nor thy maidservant. Then he puts the animals, okay? And then he says, nor thy stranger. That's that foreigner that's there that is within thy gates. In other words, he doesn't have to work either. But that's not the same thing in reference to that of the type of slavery that we had in America. So right. The people that we had, there were people that was being forced into slavery. But yet the Bible points out to us, and again, that this slavery was forced into slavery, that it was a capital crime among the Jewish people. And so selling people into slavery brought about the death penalty. And so let's see if that's what the Bible says. Deuteronomy 24 and verse 7. Any of his brethren of the children of Israel, and he deal with him as a slave or sell him, then that thief, he stole him, that thief shall die. So shalt thou put away the evil from the midst of thee. And so basically this slave there that he has, and with him as a slave, he says, and sell him. In other words, he's taken him and he's oppressing him. That's what that word means. He's exploited him. And so, and he's sold. In other words, he gives him up. He sells him. He's no longer part of him, so he'll sell him to someone else. He says that person shall die. Now, did the Jewish people back then, when they found people there, and say, for instance, one of the Jewish people had slaves, and therefore something happened, and therefore he had to get rid of them. He didn't. They would repay the debt and take the slave, and so he would give him up because to someone else, because they would go to be with someone else they owed a debt or so forth. So there were even slaves as family members. Again, go back to Exodus 12, verse 43. It's interesting to me. He says, and Jehovah said unto Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of the Passover. There no eat thereof. Oh, so they separated them. But there's a reason for that, because he goes on saying in verse 44, but every man's servant that is bought for money, when thou hast circumcised him, then shall he eat thereof. If he becomes a proselyte, he can actually eat of the Passover. And so here we
right. That's what it means when thou hast circumcised him. That means he's proselytized.
That's right. And he has a responsibility, because now he's a proselyte, actually to obey the commands that Moses has given. Right. And so they would have to treat him there, because no foreigner shall eat of it, he says. That's that word there. But as for every servant or one purchased with money, he says, if you circumcise him, then therefore, he says, they are to eat of it. And so you have that foreigner. And actually the Septuagint there has foreigner and also servant is a domestic slave, a house slave. As again, we would call them that being a servant, so forth. So we notice that a sojourner or a hired servant shall not eat of it. So that sojourner is a foreigner. He is not a Jew. He is a resident alien. Because I think I read in some of the notes there that you didn't have that among the Gentiles in reference to some parts about that as slavery. I don't recall exactly how the person was trying to put it. But it seemed like there that he was trying to say this is how the Jewish people treated the Hebrews, but you don't find Hebrews having Gentile slaves. Well,
right. They were saying that there was a different standard of treatment for Hebrew slaves and foreign slaves, which is, I mean, there are different standards, but like you said, they could proselytize and then they would have all the same rights as a Hebrew.
Yeah, so like when they got together, like for a Passover stuff like that, did they make their servants work? And especially when you stop and think about the Sabbath day, when the Sabbath day would come, that the servants didn't work, so they had that privilege, but they did not have the privilege to partake of whatever they were offering in reference to that of the Passover or any other feast that they would have. Then it would include that of a Sabbath day. They still got to rest. The servants and so forth, and that is not true when we go back and we study American slavery.
Right.
So also another passage that I found was Leviticus 25 verses 39 through 55. And I'm not going to read all of that because it takes up other time. But the idea was slavery or servanthood, as I would say, function as a form of benevolence. The Bible says there down in verse 43 of that passage of Leviticus 25:43, he says here to the slave owner, the servant, the person who owned the servant, or the servant was in their home. When we say slave, again, we don't want people to get the idea that we're talking about American slavery. We're talking about servants. And so he says in verse 42, servants which I brought forth out of the land of Egypt, they shall not be sold as a bondman. Thou shalt not rule over them with rigor. That's an interesting word. Drop down to verse 46. He says, you shall make them an inheritance for your children after you to hold for possession of them that shall take your bondman forever, but over your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule one over another with rigor, he says. And I thought that was interesting, because that simply is saying that you can't treat these people with some severity or harshness or excessive sternness. You can't do that, because that's what the word means.
Right.
And so the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor because that word is used. And so the Jews were not to rule one over another with rigor.
Right.
And so those who became servants because of their being destitute, were freed and returned to their property in the year of the Jubilee. That is reference to the Jewish people that had to sell themselves because of that of need, of benevolence. What would allowed under the law of Moses is not even remotely related to what was practiced in the United States prior to the war between the states, and even by that of the Muslims. And so basically the Bible points out all these different things. And again, we have to take all the passages and look at them. We can't just go and pick out one verse or and maybe a couple of verses that say nearly the same thing to try to prove that slavery under the law of Moses is the same thing as slavery that we had in the United States of America. And that is just simply not. I don't know how much time we have, but, I was reading some of the comments, and some would claim that it's inconsistent to have God who demands that we love our neighbor, but will allow that of slavery. But these relate to what God had required of man. And another one was that God is immoral for condemning people that don't love him. And that is because they don't love him, because he's saying, love me or else, was the comment that a person made.
Right.
But the thing is, God required, and that is a requirement that the Jewish people, and that's the requirement even today of Christians, that we are supposed to love our neighbor. Leviticus 19, verse 18, thou shalt not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. So God allowed servanthood. It is not called slavery in any good translation of the Bible in the Old Testament. And God regulated it. He, as we've already seen, there was regulation. He regulated the treatment of those servants. He required that they be freed after 6 years, and he required that the Hebrew servant be paid for his work when he was free, Deuteronomy 15. And yet forcing people, as we pointed out, into slavery brought about the death penalty. And servants had the same rights as family members, Exodus 12, verses 43 to 45. If we were to turn to the New Testament, these same principles apply. They're principles, they're eternal principles. But the New Testament was not a civil law, and God permitted slavery, but regulated it. It was regulated. I mean, we have all kinds of laws today that regulate things, especially now in our global warming. I always say global, we ought to be telling people about the global warning. The Lord's going to come back and this place is going to be destroyed. But anyway, if Christianity had demanded the release of slaves, it would have brought the wrath of the Roman Empire upon them quickly.
Right.
Because we understand that if here is a Gentile person who is a king or governor or whatever he may be over a group of people, he didn't want any uprising. We see that through the New Testament. He didn't want any uprising. Why? Because he would be killed. I mean, he would be replaced or he would be killed. And so if you can just imagine, we're not going to be slaves anymore. Well, that would just destroy the purpose that God had given in reference to that of the gospel, because of what it teaches us, how we're supposed to be treated as employees, as what we're supposed to do if we were employers, what we're supposed to do. The scriptures, if they abolished it, it would slavery by acting as leaven and changing society, it would brought about the wrath of the Roman Empire. Christianity, if Christianity had demanded the release of that of slaves, and even the same, this would be true in when God, because we could go back to the patriarchal age, and we could see that under the patriarchal ages they had servants, or as they would say, slaves. And so when if this had been demanded under the law of Moses to get rid of all the slaves, what would have happened? And Christianity, if it had been demanded, it would have caused many insincere people to try to become members of the church or to become Jewish proselytes in order to be freed from slavery.
That's right.
And so if Christianity had demanded the release of that of slaves, it would have caused many slave owners to reject Christianity, because they're not going to give up their slaves. And so they're not going to obey the gospel of Christ. And so those things would be counterproductive to the advancement of the principles of the gospel. That eventually that eliminated slavery.
Right. Right. But the standards of the New Testament for slave owners' treatment of their slaves essentially ended the kind of slavery that the Roman Empire practiced,
Right.
but it was through individual behavior, not through legislative command, we might say.
Right. Well, I know that like during the time that there was the Restoration movement, and you can read in reference to that if they had slaves back then and they became Christians, they went to worship. Now they didn't worship in the same building like we do today. They had a place, just like in reference to, if you go back to in reference to maybe some of the synagogues and so forth, how they had separation of men and women. Well, they would separate. I mean, I remember going to the theater here in Cartersville when I was a kid, and they had a really big high balcony in the theater, and that's where the black folks went. And they did not allow a white person to go up there. I mean, no black person could come down here where we were, and no white person could go up there where the black person were. You just didn't do that. And so that's kind of what we would have probably in the first century. But yet they began to realize the responsibility. And Philemon helps us with that, about the reference that takes place. All you have to do is actually go back and read that. So if we were to note, I realize that there's no probably stronger motivation to do anything than love for the person for whom the act is performed. The Lord revealed that the most basic and strongest motivation that we have is love in Matthew 22, beginning in verse 36. And so in the parable of the prodigal son, if you recall in Luke 15, the elder brother viewed his service to his father as slavery, verse 29. And you note that his usage of a Greek word there is that same word, doulos, or douleo, and it means to be a slave, serve to service. So when our service to God or our fellow man is done more out of necessity or duty, it's not going to be done effectively. So that we know that God loves those who serve, 2 Corinthians 9, and they who serves him cheerfully. So God, to me, maybe to summarize them all of what we said, is that God required humane treatment of servants. And that is not so under the America slavery, back in the time of slavery. Secondly, servants were freed after 6 years. And as we said, servants were paid for the 6 years of work, twice the ages of a hired servant. Servants were treated as family. Selling people into slavery was a capital crime. The children of Israel were not to make slaves of their fellow Jews. Fellow Jews were essentially made into hired servants, and so it appears that these rules also applied to non-Jews if a person were to take the time to study. I think maybe an example, sometimes we maybe ought to go back and studies about Joseph. We have vacation Bible schools about Joseph. We have sermons about Joseph, but sometimes go back and look. For 13 years, he was a slave, or we would say in prison. His being sold into slavery at the age of 17 must have been a very stressful thing in reference to that.
Right.
And so there are other passages that we could probably look at. I don't know what time it is. That we could actually look at. I always thought it was interesting in reference that the Bible points out in reference to a marriage, that the idea of bondage, not under bondage. The Bible talks about 1 Corinthians 7, verse 15, but that's another subject. But they use that word bondage there, and that the brother or sister is not under bondage in such a case, and that's the idea of slavery. And so
it means being bound under a legal requirement, essentially.
Yeah, see, Matt, that word there is in the perfect tense, so it's an action that is actually viewed as being completed in the past, once and for all, not needed to be repeated, according to what that means. And so here it is. We must obey the civil rulers unless we would sin by obeying them. That is, say for instance, they say, well, no, you can't have a hired servant. You have to have a slave. And we use the word slave as they did back in the time of slavery. Then we could not, as a Christian, we could not do that.
Right.
No, we could hire them as a hired servant. Like we have people come to our home, maybe cut our grass today. For the time they're here, they're a hired servant. We hired them to cut the grass, but we couldn't take them in, and like they did in the slavery times of the 1800s.
Right. Well, you've added some very valuable input to this discussion, and I really appreciate what you've added here. I also took the opportunity while I had Brother Bobby with me to get him to talk about his book, My Thorn in the Flesh. And let me just say, if you have someone in your life or you yourself struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder, then you would do well to either get yourself this book or to get it for your friend or loved one that struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder. Brother Bobby Gayton was in Vietnam during some very severe fighting, and saw the kind of combat that is just not our brains, our emotional makeup is not meant to have to deal with that kind of trauma. And so Brother Bobby dealt with that when he came back from Vietnam. And as you heard him say in his introduction, he went on to educate himself about how to deal with that. And he wrote that book, My Thorn in the Flesh, to help other people deal with that. And he spent time counseling with the VA system and counseling those that struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder. So I want to play this segment for you where he talks about his book, My Thorn in the Flesh. Added here. Before I let you go, I did want you to spend some time on your book, My Thorn in the Flesh. Let me just put that up here. Not like that, though. Let me kind of rearrange things a little bit. And well, where is it? Oh, I put the wrong tab. I put the wrong tab on the screen.
I do that sometimes.
let me get the right tab. Well, there it is. Yeah, here we go. I knew I had it pulled up. Take all the time you'd like to tell us about your book, My Thorn in the Flesh. A Vietnam veteran speaks about post-traumatic stress disorder and the Bible.
Okay. Well, the book is based upon my time in the United States Army. I was only there for 2 years. I basically I met the beautiful one, the most beautiful, the mostest, the beautifulest girl. And we were dating. We met in September, like I said, of '65, and we started dating in '66, and we were going to get married, but they had the draft and so forth, and so I said, I need to get this over with. I don't want to get married and go over to Vietnam and be killed, and you be a widow. So we put that off, and I went down and told them I wanted to go be drafted, and I told them, and they drafted me. And I went in, and they said, well, where would you, if you had 3 places to pick, where would you pick? And I said, Alaska and Hawaii, and I volunteered to go to Vietnam because I knew I was going there.
Right.
And so I did all my training, and I was a good soldier. I was promoted in every efforts of my training. And when I went to Vietnam September the 4th, 1967. I came home September the 1st, 1968. And I spent 373 days there. It was leap year, and 1968 was. And so I spent that day, an extra day. And so I was there 363 days, and I spent 279 days away from my base camp in the jungles and the woods and et cetera, the rice paddies and so forth. And to yield the severity of what casualty and so forth, a company is made up of 4 platoons of 40 people apiece supposed to be in each platoon, and that's 160 people that would be in all of those platoons, those 4 platoons. Now they did have other people that were parts of the company that stayed back and had jobs like clerks and supply sergeants, things of that sort. But when I got there, I was a replacement person, like many others that came. A bunch of us came at one time. And so we got up to, in September there, we got up to our point of 160. 40 people was in the first platoon. That was the platoon I was in. And then in November of 1967, we had 66 people in the whole company that was able to go outside into fight the Viet Cong and the NVA. Well, we built up again and started in November. They started sending people to us December. And in January, after January, they started sending all these people, building us back up. And so during January, we got back up to 160. And then Tet of 68 happened. And after Tet of 68, we had 62 people that were able to go to the field. Many of those were killed, 45, I think, that we lost in Alpha Company. But we had a bunch of people that was wounded, and so they were taken out. Many of them that were disabled for the rest of their life and were sent otherwhere because they couldn't stay in Vietnam. And so we did a lot of fighting in those days that were there. And during those battles, and one of the battles on January the 1st is the battle that they used for the movie Platoon. It's made about the 3rd Battalion of the 22nd Infantry of the 3rd Brigade of the 25th Infantry, and it's Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta companies. And we were overran there. We put over 300 bodies into one grave. And it suggested that we were hit with 2,400 NVA soldiers in PC. And our unit that day, one of the units was a mechanized unit, and they were going to leave that day. And then all of a sudden around 3:30, 4 o'clock, they told them no, they weren't going to send them out. And if they had sent them out, I wouldn't be here today. They overran us, and those people saved our lives. But it was a time that a lot of things happened. People were being wounded, and they'd take them off, and we may never ever see them again. And you wondered how, what happened to them. And the only time we found out, I was there in September 67, and in April of 68, we had a memorial service for all those people that were killed. But a lot of those people who were wounded, we never found out about them until after we got out of the military, and we started trying to find those people. And so I wrote this book, and the point is that I had a diary. I kept a diary. I started keeping a diary. When I left, Linda gave me a book to write in, and I didn't start in September. I started in November, and I stopped in April. I just could not write anymore about what had happened. My life was saved by Sergeant Jones, and he died. And the battles that we'd already gone through had hardened me in many ways. But after that happened, when we went through that of Tet and he was killed, my conscience was hardened even more so. I got to the point where I just didn't care. I quit writing home, and my mother didn't like that, and Linda didn't either. But my mother contacted the United States Army, and I was told while I was out in the field there that they had gotten a message from my family and that I needed to write home. So I started back writing, but I only wrote when someone wrote me. And when I got home, Linda and I got married, but she married a stranger, a completely stranger. And she realized that, and I began to suffer from flashbacks and things of that sort. When we were thinking about getting married 2 weeks after I got back, we were out looking at furniture one night, and after we was out on a date, so we was going to have to buy furniture for our house that we had bought. And there was a street sweeper there, and it backfired, and Linda found me on the ground. I fell down to the ground, and things of that sort. There are a number of things that we go through on PTSD, and I actually, because of my obedience to the gospel, when I was raised up out of the watery grave of baptism, as Romans 6 points out, all of my sins were washed away. Now, I went over there being a member of the denominational church that believed once saved, always saved. And therefore, I figured that I would go to heaven no matter what I did over there, and heaven would be my home. And then all of a sudden, I began, even over there, I was reading my Bible, and I began to, we had studied with someone prior to my going into the military, my sister and my brother-in-law, and some of those things stayed with me. But then we started looking around, Linda and I did, after I got out of the military. We started looking around and we started studying the Bible. And then we visited the Church of Christ, and we became members of the Church of Christ. Well, when my sins were washed away, there was a great misconception that I had, is that my mind would be cleansed.
Right.
And that's not so. Everything up there, and I should have realized this because I took data processing when I was getting out of the Army. Everything that I did, everything that I wrote, all of that was up in my mind, and there's no way that I could get rid of that. And so I had to learn, and that's the reason why that someone told me that, why is it that you go to school every place you go to preach? I said, well, I want to learn. So when I went down to Dothan, Alabama, I went to Troy University to learn about counseling and psychology. And even though I knew what the Bible said, and so I had to put those together, and that's what I did. I learned how to cope with post-traumatic stress disorder, and many of those who came back, they turned to drugs and they turned to alcohol. But I had become a Christian, and that changed my whole life. Going to Memphis School of Preaching, and I say this very honestly, going to Memphis School of Preaching saved my life. I don't know if I would ever made it through, but I learned so much. I learned so much about what the Bible says about myself. You know, make the application to yourself, as we talked about earlier, the context of things. And I use the Apostle Paul as my person in the Bible, because of all what he did, trying to destroy what to destroy God's eternal purpose. That was the church.
Right.
He tried to destroy that, but then he became a Christian, and he talks about in the Bible, the books that he wrote, the Holy Spirit guided him to tell about what he did, and so all that's recorded. And I looked all of that up, and I said, well, if he can press on this way, why can't I press on this way? And so that's basically what I adopted. 2 Peter 1 and verse 3, that God has given us all things that pertains to life and godliness. When I preached or taught, I talked a lot about godliness, but I didn't talk a lot about life. All things that pertains to life. So in other words, post-traumatic stress disorder is answered in that of the Word of God, and so that's the reason of the book, and it's done very well. It's been used by the counselors at the VA, and congregations have ordered them, and I sold them. If they bought them through Amazon, they paid full price. But for me, I sold them at cost plus the postage that it would cost to send it to them. And a lot of people bought them, but we had congregations that would have classes and use it for that of evangelism, just to bring people in to talk about it.
So if any of the viewers want to get the book, is there, I mean, would you prefer them get it from Amazon or to get it another way? Or
I get some royalties from that, because I think they still sell it for $10, or you can get it down on your not your computer. What's those readers you get?
The Kindle.
Kindle, you can get it for Kindle. I want to say for either 99 cents or $1.99 or $2.99. Because I didn't write the book to make money. I wrote the book to help. Brother Bobby Wood, he had seen some of the manuscript years ago, and he just told me, he says, you need to finish this. I gave him a copy of it as I had written it. He says, you need to finish this and publish it so that the people can get help from it. And I had a lot of preachers that I had met over the years, and many of them would order 10 or 25 of those books, and they gave them out like tracts, because it ended up.
Yeah, I had one, and I was, the reason I don't have it here to hold it up on screen is because I passed it on, like you said. It's really excellent, and things like this where and we learn that from the Bible, that sometimes by sharing our own personal story, there's other books where the writer has done that, shared their own personal story, to help others see how the gospel can help them.
Right.
And they're very effective books. Your book has been very effective in helping a lot of people. And it's kind of in two parts, right? Where the first part is your
it's the diary.
Right, the diary. I was going to say recollections, but it's
Yeah.
it's the actual diary entries from when you were in Vietnam. And then the second part is you coming to understand what it was you were afflicted with and how to deal with it, and helping other people deal with that. And
I just got back from Kentucky here last year, and I went up there and held a kind of like it's like a gospel meeting. I mean, but it was more to deal with that of veterans. That's what it was a thing for veterans to come, and I carried all my books up there that I had ordered, and when I got ready to leave, I don't know how many were left, but the fellow there bought every one of them. You know,
Right.
I had some here at home, but they're all I carried, and he bought them all. He says, I'm going to use them like tracts, and he would hand them out. So it was $3 that they would pay for the book, but maybe it would help somebody. And I appreciate the comments that people make about the book. And,
well, we have a lot of young men right now that coming out of the military, having gone through very traumatic combat situations, much like yourself. And certainly, if anybody in the viewing audience is struggling with PTSD or feels like they would be helped by this book, I would strongly encourage you to get it. And or if even I can put you in contact with Brother Bobby, I'll be happy to do that and help you any way we can. I know you've worked with the VA and counseled people struggling with PTSD and written this book that has really helped a lot of people. And so I just wanted to take some time to talk about that. I think that's a really wonderful thing.
Well, I'm on Facebook. If anybody, they can message me, and if they want a number of books, then I'll be more than happy to sell them. It's just what they cost me with postage, and that's what I usually do with individuals or even congregations. And I don't preach meetings anymore or summer series anymore like I did before, but I kind of limit myself of what I do. I was down at your place here a few weeks ago or a month or so ago. I just go to different places every once in a while but when they call for me to go to talk about this, if it's a veterans thing, I try to go, and try sometimes to get Linda to go with me so she can help me drive. So I appreciate being with you. I really do.
Well, I really appreciate you being on today. And one of these days I'm going to have you on, and just hearing what you said about your connection with Paul and how you've made that connection with your experience and Paul's experience, it kind of helped me see why that was such a powerful lesson when you preached Paul, one who won. And I mean, it really had an impact on me. Like I say, I think it was probably hearing that lesson shortly after my conversion that led to me being a preacher. I wanted to, that's what I thought. I wanted to be like Paul. So one of these days I'm going to have you on to preach that lesson. Paul, one who won.
I'll have to find it.
Oh, I'm sure you could
I don't know
preach it off the top of your head.
I don't know if they was publishing the lectureships that year or not.
I'm not sure, but that was the year that I was baptized there at the Duluth Church of Christ.
So that was 99.
96.
96.
It was the theme of the lectureship was going for the gold, and it was because the 96 Olympics were in Atlanta that year.
Yeah, I remember.
And I was baptized in April of that year there at Duluth, and so I attended the lectureship, and that lesson that you preached, Paul, one who won, on that theme, going for the gold, going through Paul's past and how he went from being a persecutor of the church to being the great missionary of the church, and how when before he died, he said, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. And yeah, on that theme, one who won. It's just such a powerful lesson. I've always been very thankful for you, to you for that lesson.
Thank you.
I've really enjoyed having you on. Your contribution to the discussion that we've been having for the past few weeks, and I'm gonna let you be the capstone on that discussion, because I think we've said about all we can say on it. If the skeptics want to keep beating it, well, they can. How did Paul say about he wasn't one who flailed at the air, but he fought with focus, right? Well, they can keep flailing at the air if they want to. Hopefully, this will bring some around to see the difference between an honest discussion on the issue and just trying to pick at something that they're using dishonestly based on a modern conception of something, rather than the actual ancient context of it, as you pointed out. So I really appreciate that. Well, thank you for being on today, Bobby, and I'll look forward to doing it again real soon.
Okay, thank you.
All right. We will take some time to go through the live chat and see what questions and comments you have posted there. I already said hello to Lori and Gwendolyn. So let me respond to Angela Noble. And I'm sure that's supposed to be when do you think the rapture is? I can't really say much about typos because I make them all the time too. But in my case, they're not really typos, because I know I typed it right, but my computer just didn't put it the way that I typed it. Right? That's what we say about typos, right? So the question, when do you think the rapture is? Well, let me bring my Bible up on the screen and kind of rearrange some things here. Okay. So in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 13 beginning, I'm going to start with 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 13 and answering that question, Angela. When do you think the rapture is? The Apostle Paul says here, "But I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus." That is, those that have died prior to Jesus coming. They're going to be raised first, and they're going to come with Jesus when he comes. "For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who are asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore, comfort one another with these words." Now, the reason I go to this passage is because this is where that word rapture comes from. Not in the Greek. It's the word rapture is not in the Bible. It's not a Greek word. It's not the English translation of a Greek word. It's not in the Bible. The word rapture is not there, and the premillennialist idea of the rapture is not in the Bible. So the word nor the idea is in the Bible at all. But the reason I go here is because the Greek word that's translated shall be caught up here, harpazo, and I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but that's how that's Greek by way of Georgia. So that Greek word harpazo was translated into Latin, and the Latin translation of that word is rapturo. Rapturo. That's where the word rapture comes from. And the actual definition of the word itself, there's nothing wrong with the word rapture. It's perfectly fine word because it just means to be caught up, right? And we use it that way kind of in a metaphorical sense sometimes, don't we? That something is rapturous, or we were just in rapture over something. It means that we were just totally caught up in something, or something is just totally captivating and just catches us up in it. Right? That's the meaning of harpazo. That's translated rapturo in Latin, and the English transliteration of the Latin word rapturo into rapture. But premillennialist false doctrine, premillennialist false teaching has used that word rapture to talk about part of their man-made false system of doctrine. And that is not in the Bible. This idea that the faithful on earth are going to be caught up from the earth secretly to meet Jesus in the air, and to be in the air with Jesus for either 3.5 years or 7 years, depending on whether you're a post-trib rapturist, or whether you believe a mid-trib rapture, and it's just not what the Bible teaches. That is not in the Bible. Look at what this says. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord. That's the second coming of Christ. So how many comings of Christ are there? Well, he came the first time. That's what the Old Testament prophets were talking about. So if I pull up the comment section, I'm going to have to drop the Bible off of the screen to pull up the comment section from YouTube. If I go to the comment section on the video that I just posted today, talking about premillennialism, you see in the comments these posts of Old Testament prophecy, Obadiah 1:15-18. For the day of the Lord is near upon all the heathen. As thou hast done, it shall be done unto thee. Thy reward shall return upon thine own head. And, going on down through that quotation from Obadiah 1:15-18. Why would an Old Testament prophet be prophesying not only, something beyond the first coming of Christ, which hadn't happened yet from this prophet's perspective, to then something that is going to be connected with the second coming of Christ, or even a third or fourth coming of Christ, as premillennialism teaches? The Old Testament prophets were prophesying the first coming of Christ, not the second coming of Christ. So premillennialism goes back to these Old Testament prophecies. Here's another one that the same person quoted from Isaiah 14:2-3, quoting Old Testament prophecy to try to say that this is talking about something that's still in the future to us. Well, why would the Old Testament prophets be prophesying things past the first coming of Christ when they were looking forward to the Messiah coming the first time? They were looking forward to the Messianic kingdom that is fulfilled in the New Testament church. And so it just doesn't make any sense that these Old Testament prophecies would be prophesying things beyond the first coming of Christ. So if you ask me, when do you think the rapture is? Well, insofar as the Latin word rapturo is the translation of the Greek word harpazo, in the biblical text here, it's going to happen at the second coming of Christ. And what else is going to happen at the second coming of Christ is that the earth is going to be destroyed. There's not going to be any earth after the second coming of Christ. So the idea that the rapture is going to happen and then there's going to be the tribulation on earth. I just talked about the great tribulation in my Bible class yesterday, and how this idea that the great tribulation is something that is still in the future for the church is completely contrary to biblical teaching. And in Acts chapter 8, where we were studying yesterday in the Bible class, it says right here, at that time, a great persecution arose against the church. Well, what's the difference between great persecution and great tribulation? They're the same thing. And so when the Bible talks about the great tribulation, it's talking about the persecution that the church has been facing from its establishment. The struggle that the church faces in a sin-sick world, and how the world persecutes the church. But the church will ultimately be victorious, because at the second coming of Christ, the church will be taken to heaven to be with God forever. And when Christ comes back at the second coming of Christ, there's not going to be a pre-event kind of thing with the rapture, and then there's going to be the tribulation on earth after the rapture, and then there's going to be this 1,000-year millennial kingdom that the Bible doesn't talk anywhere about. And I know you go to Revelation 20, where it talks about Satan being bound for 1,000 years, and that's talking about the church age from Acts chapter 2 on through till the second coming of Christ. And it's using 1,000 the way that the Bible uses 1,000 in numerous places to talk about the totality of something in a symbolic way, not a literal number of years. So when Christ comes back, we drop down in this same chapter to Revelation chapter 20 and verse 11, and look at what it says. Then I saw a great white throne, and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away. Now that's a figurative way of saying, a symbolic way of depicting the fact that the earth and the heavens, the physical earth and the physical heavens, will cease to exist when Christ comes back. See, he goes on to say, and there was found no place for them. Again, that's a symbolic way of saying, a figurative way of depicting the end of the material universe. There will not be a material existence after the second coming of Christ. So there's not going to be an earth to have a millennial kingdom on. The church is the kingdom of God. And that's, again, I would encourage you to go, if you're watching on YouTube, to go to my channel, and it'll be the most recent video upload tomorrow. The sermon will drop that I preached yesterday morning. Philip preached the kingdom, and between the Bible class and that sermon, the Bible class on the first part of Acts chapter 8 and the sermon, Philip preached the kingdom. You'll see beyond any shadow of a doubt, irrefutably so, that the kingdom that the New Testament talks about is the church, not some future millennial kingdom that's going to be established, at some point in the future after these literal events take place that the Bible talks about in a highly symbolic way. So, in answer to the question, when do you think the rapture is? Well, the biblical idea of that is at the second coming of Christ, when all things come to an end, like we read about in 2 Peter chapter 3, beginning with verse 10. But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. When? At the second coming of Christ. So where is the rapture? Where's the tribulation? Where's the 1,000-year millennial kingdom, so-called millennial kingdom on earth? Where is all of that? After the second coming of Christ. After the second coming of Christ, there's not anything. That's why the church age is the last days, because there's not anything coming after the church age. It is the end, over. And we will spend eternity in where we have prepared to spend eternity while we were in this world, while we were on this earth. That's why we have to live for Jesus now, so that we can live with Jesus then. So the biblical concept is going to be when Christ comes back. When Christ, the second coming of Christ, everything's going to come to an end. Those that are going to heaven are going to go to heaven. Those that are going to hell are going to go to hell. And that'll be the end of it. According to the premillennialist concept of it, there's no such thing. There's no such thing as the premillennialist concept of the rapture. It doesn't exist. Not in the Bible. All right. So I appreciate your question, Angela. I hope that answers your question. There's not any other live chat I need to catch up with. So I will ramble on here for a minute or two to see if anybody else wants to jump in the live chat. Whether on Rumble, I'm watching the live chat on Rumble, and I'm watching the live chat on 3 Facebook channels and a YouTube channel. And so if you want to jump in the live chat on any of those and ask any questions, make any comments, I want to say again how much I love and appreciate Brother Bobby Gayton. I'm not sure that I would be a preacher today if I hadn't heard Brother Bobby Gayton preach that lesson just a couple of weeks after my being baptized. If I hadn't heard Brother Bobby Gayton preach that lesson, Paul, one who won, and to so powerfully impress on my mind the victorious life of Paul as he served Christ, and you know, as a new convert, you know, I just thought I want to be like Paul. I want to serve Christ like Paul served Christ. And so I really have a great deal of love and respect for Brother Bobby Gayton ever since that time. And then some years later, I moved to Jasper, which you heard him make reference to in our discussion together. I moved to Jasper in 2000, 2001, maybe 2000, 2001, 2000 or 2001. I'd have to go back and look to see the specific date, but Brother Bobby Gayton was in Cartersville, and we got to know each other pretty well during that time. I would go to Cartersville to their activities, and he taught a Thursday night class at that time, and me and Mary would go over there for his Thursday night class, and we had opportunities to get together and spend time together and do some things together. And so I got to know him much better during that time, and have always just really enjoyed him and his service for the cause of Christ. So I hope you enjoyed our discussion. And if you have any questions, comments about that, if you're watching this back later after the live stream, then please do post your questions and comments in the comment section below. And Lord willing, we will carry on the discussion in the next episode of Bible Q&A. Thanks for watching.